Bavaria, April 1945. Sergeant Michael Carson pushed through the door of what had been a makeshift German field hospital, his rifle raised, boots crunching on broken glass. The building reeked of antiseptic and something darker old blood, infection, death postponed rather than prevented. In the courtyard beyond, morning light caught a figure tied to a wooden post. A woman in a torn nurse's uniform, her head hanging forward, blonde hair matted with dried blood. Around her neck hung a cardboard sign, the words scrawled in angry German. Veritor, traitor. Carson lowered his rifle slowly. She was breathing. Barely. Sergeant Michael Carson had been in combat for 9 months, from Normandy through France and into Germany itself. He was 24 years old, from Pennsylvania, the son of a steelworker who taught him that the world was divided into good people and bad people, and war existed to separate the two. By April 1945, Carson no longer believed in such clean categories, but the habit of thinking in them persisted. His unit Company B, 45th Infantry Division, had taken the small Bavarian town of Regen without much resistance. The German forces were collapsing, falling back toward some imaginary defensive line that would never materialize. What remained were fragments, old men with rifles, teenagers in oversized uniforms, medical personnel trying to treat wounded in buildings that lacked supplies, electricity, or hope. The field hospital occupied a former school on the town's eastern edge. Carson's squad had been tasked with clearing its standard procedure, making sure no armed soldiers were hiding among the wounded, securing any supplies that might be useful. They approached cautiously, expecting possible ambush, but found only silence. Private Tommy Walsh kicked open the front door. The interior was dim, dusty light filtering through windows, covered with blankets to block observation from the air. Rows of wounded lay on the floor, German soldiers in various states of injury, some groaning, some unconscious, some staring at the ceiling, with the blank expression of men who checked out mentally, even if their bodies hadn't quite died yet. A German doctor, elderly, wearing a blood-stained white coat, raised his hands immediately. He spoke in heavily accented English. "We are medical personnel. No weapons. Only wounded here." Carson lowered his rifle slightly, but kept it ready. "How many wounded?" 42. Most need evacuation to proper hospital. We have no supplies. Nothing for 3 days. Standard situation. The German medical system had collapsed along with everything else. American forces were finding scenes like this, constantly wounded men abandoned by retreating armies, doctors trying to keep them alive with nothing but willpower and improvisation. "All right," Carson said. "We'll arrange evacuation. But first, we need to search the building. Make sure there are no armed soldiers pretending to be wounded." The doctor nodded wearily. He'd probably been through this process multiple times already as the front lines swept past. "Of course, but please, some men are critical. Do not disturb them." Carson and his squad moved through the building methodically. Most of the wounded were exactly what they appeared to be, soldiers too injured to fight, waiting for medical care or death, whichever came first. No hidden weapons, no prepared ambush. Just the grinding reality of war's aftermath. In the back, through a door that opened onto a courtyard, Carson found her. The woman was tied to a wooden post with rope that cut into her wrists and waist. She wore what had once been a nurse's uniform white dress, now stained and torn, the Red Cross armband still visible on her left sleeve. Her face was bruised, one eye swollen shut, her lips split and crusted with dried blood. Around her neck hung the sign, Veritor. Carson felt something cold settle in his stomach. He'd seen atrocities before, civilians caught in crossfire, prisoners mistreated, the casual violence that war made routine. But something about this scene struck him as different. This wasn't collateral damage. This was deliberate punishment. He called over his shoulder, "Walsh, get the doc, now." The German doctor appeared in the doorway, saw the woman, and his face went carefully blank. Not surprised, just resigned. "Who is she?" Carson demanded. Nurse. Was nurse. The doctor's English deteriorated under stress. "She help enemy wounded. American prisoners." "They find out. Do this." "They? Who's they?" The doctor hesitated, calculating whether answering would create more problems than silence. Finally, "Officers. German officers who retreat through here yesterday. They find her treating American prisoners. Decide she is traitor. Do this and leave." Carson moved closer to the woman. Her breathing was shallow but steady. She was alive, though her condition suggested she'd been tied here for hours, maybe a full day. In April Bavaria, nighttime temperatures still dropped near freezing. Exposure alone could have finished her. "Cut her down," Carson ordered Walsh. Walsh produced a knife and sawed through the ropes. The woman's legs buckled when released. Carson caught her before she hit the ground, surprised by how light she was, not just thin but fragile, as if the punishment had burned away everything except essential structure. Her eye, the one that wasn't swollen, shut opened, slightly. She looked at Carson's uniform, at the American flag patch on his shoulder, and something like recognition flickered across her face. Then she passed out, going limp in his arms. The woman's name was Sister Margarethe Schiller. The German doctor provided this information reluctantly, aware that sharing details about someone labeled a traitor might implicate him by association. But Carson pressed, and the story emerged in fragments. Margarethe was 32 years old, a trained nurse who'd been conscripted into military medical service in 1943. She'd worked at various field hospitals on the Eastern Front, then transferred to the West in late 1944 as the situation deteriorated. She was competent, professional, and possessed of what the doctor called unfortunate compassion. The trouble had started 2 weeks earlier. The field hospital had received a group of wounded American prisoners paratroopers captured during a failed reconnaissance mission. They needed immediate medical attention. Under the Geneva Conventions, wounded prisoners were supposed to receive the same care as one's own soldiers. But in practice, with supplies critically short and German wounded filling every available space, American prisoners often came last. Margarethe had treated them anyway. She'd used bandages, morphine, surgical supplies on American soldiers, when German officers thought those resources should be reserved for their own men. When confronted, she'd cited the Geneva Conventions and professional ethics. The confrontation escalated. Words became accusations. Someone used the word traitor. Then the field hospital was overrun. Allied forces advancing faster than expected, German units retreating in disorder. In the chaos, a group of Wehrmacht officers' fanatics who still believed in fighting to the last rather than accepting inevitable defeat found evidence of Margarethe's betrayal, medical records showing she'd treated enemy prisoners, testimony from German wounded who'd watched Americans receive care they felt should have been theirs. The officers convened an impromptu tribunal. No defense counsel, no formal procedure, just angry men looking for someone to blame for the catastrophic defeat consuming their country. They found Margarethe guilty of treason against the fatherland. The punishment: exposure. Tie her to a post in the courtyard and leave her for Allied forces to find a message to other Germans who might consider helping the enemy. They'd done this 36 hours before Carson's unit arrived. Left her tied, beaten, with a sign declaring her crime. Then they'd retreated eastward, toward a defensive line that existed only in their increasingly delusional strategic fantasies. Carson listened to the doctor's explanation with growing anger. Not the hot anger of combat, but the cold fury of someone confronting institutional cruelty. These officers, who'd presumably taken oaths to uphold military honor, had punished a nurse for following medical ethics, had labeled mercy as treason. "Where are they now?" Carson asked. "These officers?" The doctor shrugged. "Gone. Retreat toward Munich, maybe." Or dead. Many officers are dead now. Carson turned to Walsh. Get her to our medical station. Tell Captain Hayes we need immediate attention exposure, dehydration, possible internal injuries from the beating. Walsh hesitated. Sarge, she's enemy medical personnel. Don't we need authorization before? I'm giving authorization. Move. Walsh nodded and disappeared. Carson looked down at Margaretti, now lying on a stretcher improvised from a blanket and poles. Her breathing had steadied slightly, but she remained unconscious. The bruising on her face was turning purple and green, the sign of injuries at least a day old. The German doctor approached cautiously. You help her? Yes. Why? She is enemy. German. Traitor to her own people, according to some. Carson met his eyes. She's a nurse who treated wounded prisoners. That's not treason. That's doing her job, right? We don't punish people for that. The doctor nodded slowly. You are not like them. The officers who did this? No, we're not. Captain Robert. Hayes ran the division, S Forward Medical Station, a collection of tents and trucks that followed the combat units, providing emergency care before evacuating serious cases to hospitals in the rear. He'd seen every kind of battlefield injury imaginable, but when Margaretti arrived, he spent extra time on the examination. Severe dehydration, he told Carson afterward. Exposures caused some hypothermia damage. The beating gave her a concussion, broken ribs, internal bruising. She'll survive, but she needs time and rest. Can we keep her here? Hayes frowned. She's enemy medical personnel. Technically should be processed as a POW and sent to a detention facility. Technically. What about practically? Hayes considered. He'd been practicing medicine for 15 years before the war, had taken an oath about doing no harm, still believed that oath meant something even in the middle of Germany's collapse. Practically, I can keep her here for medical observation. Say a week, maybe 10 days. After that, she gets processed like any other prisoner. Fair enough. Margaretti regained consciousness on the second day. Hayes was changing her for when her eyes opened both now, though the swollen one was still mostly shut. She stared at the tent ceiling, at the American medical equipment, at Hayes's uniform, processing where she was. You're in an American medical station, Hayes said slowly, unsure if she understood English. You're safe now. We're treating your injuries. She turned her head slightly, wincing at the movement. When she spoke, her voice was rough from dehydration, but her English was clear. Why? Why what? Why help me? I am German. Enemy. You're a nurse. You were punished for doing your job correctly. That's reason enough. Tears slid down her cheeks. Not dramatic sobbing, just quiet tears that suggested something inside her had finally broken. Not from cruelty, but from unexpected kindness after systematic betrayal. Hayes let her cry. Sometimes that was the only appropriate medical intervention. Over the following days, Margaretti's physical condition improved. The dehydration resolved. The bruising faded from purple to yellow-green. The broken ribs began healing. But the psychological impact ran deeper. She was withdrawn, spoke only when directly questioned, spent hours staring at the tent walls with an expression Hayes recognized from combat trauma patients, that 1,000-yard stare that suggested the person behind the eyes had gone somewhere else. Carson visited daily, ostensibly to check on a prisoner, but really from a sense of responsibility. He'd found her. He'd ordered her rescue. Somehow that created an obligation to see the process through. On the fourth day, she was sitting up when he entered. Her face had regained some color, though the bruising still mapped her beating in detail. She watched him approach with wary attention. How are you feeling? Carson asked. Better, thank you. Her English carried a slight accent, but was otherwise fluent. You are the soldier who found me. Yes. Why did you help? You could have left me. Would have been easier. Carson pulled up a crate to sit on. Leaving someone to die when you can help isn't easier. It's just cowardice dressed up as practicality. Margaretti studied him. You don't hate Germans. I hate what Germany's done. The regime, the war, the millions of deaths. But individual Germans? He paused. I try to judge people by their actions, not their nationality. My countrymen judged me by my actions. Decided I was traitor. Your countrymen were wrong. You treated wounded prisoners according to professional ethics and international law. That's not treason. That's basic human decency. She was quiet for a long moment. Then, I thought Americans would be like them. The officers said you were cruel, that you treated prisoners badly, that capture meant torture. I thought if you found me, you would finish what they started. And instead you gave me medical care, clean bed, food, safety, everything they said you wouldn't do. Why did they lie? Propaganda keeps soldiers fighting. If you believe surrender means torture, you fight harder. If you know the enemy treats prisoners well, surrender becomes attractive. Margaretti nodded slowly. So they lied to keep us loyal. And when I showed mercy to enemy wounded, I revealed the lie. That's why they called me traitor, not because I helped Americans, but because I proved the propaganda was false. Carson hadn't thought about it that way, but she was right. Her actions had demonstrated that Americans treated prisoners decently, which contradicted everything the regime's narrative required. In a system built on lies, telling the truth became the ultimate betrayal. On the 6th day, a military intelligence officer arrived at the medical station. Major William Bradford specialized in interviewing German POWs, gathering information about unit dispositions, command structures, anything useful for the ongoing advance. He'd heard about Margaretti's case and wanted to interview her. Carson sat in during the interview, partly as witness and partly from protective instinct. Bradford was professional but thorough, taking detailed notes as Margaretti described her experience. Tell me about the American prisoners you treated, Bradford said. Margaretti described them. 5 paratroopers, captured during a reconnaissance mission, all wounded. 3 had serious injuries, gunshot wounds, shrapnel damage, 1 with a compound fracture that needed immediate attention. What treatment did you provide? Standard trauma care. Cleaned wounds, administered morphine for pain, set the broken bone, monitored for infection. 2 needed surgery. I assisted the doctor. All survived the immediate injuries. And this caused problems with German officers? Yes. They said supplies were short, that German wounded should come first, that helping Americans was betrayal. I cited Geneva Conventions. They didn't care. Bradford wrote carefully. Did they threaten you before the punishment? They said I was soft, weak, that I put enemy lives above fatherland. I told them medical ethics don't recognize nationality. That made them angrier. Who specifically ordered your punishment? Margaretti named 3 officers a major and 2 captains, whose names Bradford recognized from intelligence reports. Hardliners, true believers who'd refused to accept Germany's inevitable defeat. The kind of officers who created problems, even for their own side. One more question, Bradford said. The American prisoners you treated, do you know what happened to them? Margaretti's face fell. No, they were evacuated when we retreated. I don't know if they survived, but Bradford knew. He checked before coming. All 5 prisoners had been recovered by advancing American forces. All had survived, thanks largely to the emergency medical care a German nurse had provided despite threats and eventual punishment. They're alive, Bradford told her, all 5, recovering in hospitals in France. You saved them. Margaretti's hands began to shake. She pressed them together, trying to control the trembling, but couldn't. Carson saw tears forming in her eyes. Not sad tears this time, but something more complicated. Relief, maybe. Vindication. Proof that her choice had mattered. Bradford closed his notebook. Thank you for your testimony, Sister Schiller. Your information will be useful. And for what it's worth, what you did was right. The officers who punished you will face consequences if we catch them." After Bradford left, Margaretti sat silently for a long time. Finally, she looked at Carson and said, "They lived. All of them. It makes everything worth it. Even the punishment? Even that. Because I know now that mercy works. That treating people with dignity produces better outcomes than cruelty. The officers tried to prove otherwise, tried to show that loyalty to the fatherland meant abandoning ethics. They failed. The Americans lived, and their recovery proves I was right." On the 8th day, orders came down. Margaretti was to be transferred to a POW processing facility for enemy medical personnel. From there, she'd be evaluated, documented, eventually repatriated to Germany when the war ended and occupation authorities sorted out the chaos. Captain Hayes delivered the news during morning rounds. Margaretti accepted it without visible emotion, though Carson, watching from the tent entrance, saw her hands tighten on the blanket. After Hayes left, Carson approached. "How do you feel about being processed as a POW?" "I am prisoner. It's appropriate. But," she hesitated, "I don't know what happens after. When I return to Germany, the officers who punished me are still out there. Their ideology is still out there. Men who believe mercy is weakness, that helping the enemy is treason. What happens to people like me in whatever Germany becomes?" It was a good question. Germany was being destroyed, occupied, rebuilt, according to Allied plans that were still being formulated. Nobody knew what post-war German society would look like, whether it would punish people like Margaretti or recognize that they'd been right. That evening, Carson found Captain Hayes in the medical tent, reviewing patient charts by lamplight. "Sir, I want to ask about Sister Schiller's case." Hayes looked up. "What about it? Is there any way to document what happened to her? Her treatment of American prisoners, the punishment she received, the fact that the men she saved are all alive? Something official that might protect her when she returns to Germany?" Hayes considered. "I could write a medical report documenting her injuries and their cause. Major Bradford could submit intelligence reports about her testimony. But protection?" He shook his head. "That's beyond what we can guarantee. Post-war justice is going to be complicated. We can't promise anything, but we can create a record. Evidence that she did the right thing. Yes, that we can do." Over the next 2 days, Hayes prepared a detailed medical report. Bradford contributed an intelligence assessment. Carson wrote his own statement as the soldier who discovered her. Together, the documents painted a picture. German nurse treats enemy prisoners according to professional ethics, is punished by fanatical officers, is rescued by Americans, and provides valuable testimony. The documents were filed with multiple agencies: military intelligence, Judge Advocate General's Office, Red Cross. Multiple copies, multiple locations, ensuring the story would survive even if individual records were lost. Margaretti received copies before her transfer. She held the papers carefully, as if they were fragile. "Thank you," she said to Carson, "for everything. For finding me, for helping me, for making sure people know what happened. You did the right thing. Someone needed to document that. Will it matter? And whatever comes next? I don't know. But at least the truth will be on record. Sometimes that's all we can do. Make sure truth survives, even when everything else is burning." Margaretha left the medical station on a gray morning in late April. She climbed into a truck with other German post medical personnel, mostly doctors and nurses captured during the Wehrmacht's collapse. They were heading to a processing facility near Munich, would be documented and interviewed, eventually released to occupation authorities. Carson watched the truck depart, feeling something he couldn't quite name. Not affection exactly. He'd known her barely 2 weeks. More like solidarity with someone who'd made hard choices and paid for them. Someone who'd chosen ethics over loyalty and been punished for it. He returned to his unit, back to the grinding routine of occupation duty. The fighting was nearly over. Germany would surrender within 2 weeks, but the work of managing a defeated country was just beginning. Clearing towns, processing prisoners, maintaining order, starting the long process of reconstruction. But Margarethi's story stayed with him. During quiet moments, he'd think about the nurse tied to a post, about officers who'd labeled mercy as treason, about the choice she'd made to treat wounded Americans, even knowing the cost. That choice revealed something important about how systems worked, how totalitarian ideologies required cruelty, how maintaining them meant punishing anyone who demonstrated that alternatives existed. In early May, after Germany's surrender, Carson's unit was reassigned to guard duty at a POW camp outside Frankfurt. Thousands of German prisoners being processed, documented, prepared for eventual repatriation. He walked through the compound sometimes, watching prisoners adapt to captivity, seeing the same pattern Margarethi had described. Men expecting cruelty and finding decent treatment, propaganda confronting reality, assumptions crumbling under evidence. One afternoon, he encountered Major Bradford in the camp administrative building. Bradford was processing intelligence reports, documenting the Wehrmacht's final weeks, building the historical record. "Sir, do you remember Sister Schiller? The nurse we found in Regen?" Bradford looked up. "Of course. Why? Did anything come of her testimony? Were the officers who punished her ever caught?" Bradford checked his files. 2 of them died in the final battles. The Major Hoffmann was captured by Russian forces. Presumably, he's in a Soviet camp now. Justice of a sort, though not the kind we'd have preferred. And Sister Schiller? Processed through Munich, documented as enemy medical personnel, currently at a women's POW facility outside Nuremberg. She'll be released when repatriation begins, probably by summer. Will she face charges for treating American prisoners? Bradford smiled slightly. From us? No, we don't charge people for following the Geneva Conventions. From German authorities? He shrugged. Depends on what kind of Germany emerges from occupation. If it's built on the old ideology, she could face problems. If it's something new, she might be recognized as someone who had it right all along. Carson nodded. The uncertainty was frustrating but realistic. Germany's future was being decided by people far above his rank, by political forces he couldn't influence. All he could do was make sure one nurse's story was documented, preserved, available as evidence for whatever tribunals or historical accounts came later. In August 1945, 3 months after the war's end, Carson received an unexpected letter. It had been forwarded through multiple military postal channels, finally reaching him at his new posting in Berlin. The envelope was worn, the handwriting unfamiliar. Inside, a single page in careful English. "Dear Sergeant Carson, I hope this letter finds you well. I am writing from Nuremberg, where I remain in POW facility awaiting repatriation. I wanted you to know that your kindness in April changed my life. Not just saving me, though that mattered, but showing me that mercy could exist between enemies. That professional ethics could transcend nationality. That doing right was possible even when one's own side called it treason. The documents you helped create have protected me. When German authorities questioned my treatment of American prisoners, I showed them the medical reports, the testimony, the evidence that what I did was proper. They accepted it. I will not face charges. More importantly, the documents proved something I needed proven, that I was right. That mercy works better than cruelty. That treating people with dignity produces better outcomes than treating them as objects. The 5 American prisoners I helped have recovered fully. That outcome validates everything I believed about medical ethics. I return to Germany soon. To what? I don't know. My country is destroyed, occupied, divided. The future is uncertain. But I know now that I want to rebuild it on different principles, on the kind of principles you demonstrated when you found me tied to that post and chose to help rather than ignore. Thank you for showing me that kindness between enemies is possible. Thank you for documenting what happened. Thank you for giving me hope that better systems can exist. With gratitude and respect, Sister Margarethe Schiller. Carson read the letter 3 times, then folded it carefully and placed it in his footlocker with other documents he was keeping: photos, news clippings, pieces of evidence that what he'd experienced was real. The war was over, but its lessons needed preserving. He wrote back that evening, sending his letter through military postal channels, with fingers crossed it would reach her before repatriation scattered everyone. Dear Sister Schiller, I'm glad you're safe and that the documents helped. You deserved protection, not punishment, for doing your job correctly. You asked what kind of Germany you're returning to. I can't answer that. The occupation authorities are still figuring it out themselves. But I can tell you what I hope, that it becomes a place where people like you are recognized as having been right all along, where mercy isn't labeled treason, where professional ethics matter more than political loyalty. The 5 men you saved are alive because you chose to treat them with dignity. That choice ripples forward. They have families, futures, lives that wouldn't exist if you'd followed your officer's orders. That's not treason. That's the opposite of treason. That's building something better than the system that tried to destroy you. Good luck with whatever comes next. I hope Germany deserves you. Respectfully, Sergeant Michael Carson. Margarethe returned to Germany in September 1945. The country she found bore little resemblance to the one she'd left. Cities were rubble. Borders were arbitrary lines drawn by occupation forces. The government that had punished her no longer existed, replaced by military administrations trying to create order from chaos. She settled in Munich, working at a hospital that was slowly being rebuilt from bomb damage. The medical system was desperate for trained personnel, and her experience made her valuable despite her complicated history. The documents Carson had helped create proving she de-treated prisoners according to international law protected her from accusations that might otherwise have ended her career. She didn't talk about the war much. Like many Germans, she found the subject painful, loaded with guilt and loss and questions about complicity. But she kept the letters from Carson, kept the medical reports, kept the evidence that at least once she'd made the right choice even when it cost her. In 1947, she was approached by a British officer working for the Occupation Authority's Education Division. They were creating curricula for German schools, trying to teach principles of democracy and human rights to students who'd been raised on authoritarian ideology. They wanted her to speak to teachers about medical ethics, about the importance of professional standards that transcended political pressure. She agreed reluctantly. Standing in front of 30 German teachers, she told her story: the American prisoners, the treatment she'd provided, the punishment she'd received, the American soldiers who'd saved her, and documented what had happened. The officers who punished me believed loyalty to the state was more important than professional ethics, she said. They were wrong. Following proper medical procedures, treating all wounded equally, that's not betrayal. That's the foundation of civilized society. When we abandon ethics for political loyalty, we lose our humanity. The teachers listened in silence. Some took notes. Some looked uncomfortable. The subject was too fresh, too raw. But they listened. Afterward, a young teacher approached her. How did you know you were right? When everyone around you said you were wrong, how did you trust your own judgment? Margarethe thought about it. I didn't know. Not for certain. But I knew what my training taught me, what the Geneva Conventions required, what basic human decency demanded. I followed those things and hoped they were sufficient. And they were? The 5 men I treated survived. They have lives now because I chose mercy over loyalty. That's proof enough for me. In 1955, 10 years after the war's end, Margarethe received a letter from America. The envelope was postmarked Pennsylvania, the return address unfamiliar. Inside, a note from Michael Carson. He'd returned to civilian life, married his high school sweetheart, taken over his father's hardware store in Pittsburgh. He wrote about ordinary things, business, family, the challenges of readjusting to peacetime. Then, in the final paragraph, "I've been in contact with one of the men you saved, a paratrooper named James Mitchell. He lives in Ohio now, has 3 kids, works as an electrician. He wanted me to tell you that he thinks about you sometimes, about the German nurse who treated his wounds when she could have left him to die. He says you changed how he thinks about enemies and humanity. Says his children will grow up knowing that story." "That has to count for something," Margaretti replied immediately. The correspondence continued sporadically over the following year's updates on their lives, reflections on the war's legacy, discussions about how to remember trauma without being consumed by it. In 1975, 30 years after the war, a reunion was organized in Munich for veterans and German civilians who'd experienced the final battles. Former enemies would meet, share stories, attempt reconciliation. Margaretti was invited. So was Carson. They met in a hotel lobby, 2 people in their 60s who de-intersected for 2 weeks in 1945 and carried that brief connection forward through decades. Carson looked older, grayer, but his eyes held the same qualities she remembered. Direct gaze that suggested he still evaluated people by their actions rather than their categories. "Thank you for coming," Margaretti said. "Wouldn't have missed it. How have you been?" They talked for hours. Margaretti described her post-war life, the hospital work, the teaching, the slow process of rebuilding a medical system from ruins. Carson talked about his business, his family, his years of processing what he'd seen during the war. "Do you ever regret it?" Carson asked. "Treating those prisoners, knowing what it cost you?" "Never. The punishment was terrible, but the choice was right. I proved that mercy works, that professional ethics matter. That lesson shaped everything I did afterward. You influenced a lot of people. The teachers you spoke to, the students they taught, the doctors you trained. That ripples forward because you documented it, because you made sure the truth survived. Without those reports, I could have been just another name in the chaos. Instead, I became evidence that alternatives existed." They attended the formal ceremony, the evening speeches about reconciliation, about building a peaceful Europe, about learning from the past without being trapped by it. Politicians and generals spoke in abstract terms about historical forces and political necessities. But afterward, in a smaller gathering of veterans and civilians, the conversations were more personal. Former soldiers talked with German families who'd sheltered them. Nurses discussed treating enemy wounded. Civilians described being helped by occupation forces when they had every reason to expect cruelty. One man, James Mitchell, the paratrooper Margaretti had treated, found her in the crowd. He was 52 now, balding, carrying photos of his grandchildren. "You probably don't remember me," he said. But she did. His face had been different and younger, wounded, frightened, but she recognized him. The compound fracture. "Left leg," Mitchell smiled. "That's right. Said it perfectly. Healed without complications. I've been walking on that leg for 30 years thanks to you. I was doing my job. You were doing it right, when it would have been easier and safer to do it wrong. That matters." They talked for an hour. Mitchell described his life, the family, the career, the ordinary blessings of survival. He told her his children knew her story, that his grandchildren would know it too. "You're part of my family's history now," he said. "The German nurse who chose mercy." That's the story that gets passed down. Margaretti Schiller died in 1991 at age 78. Her obituary in the Munich newspaper mentioned her decades of medical service, but only briefly referenced the war. Most people who read it never knew about the American prisoners, the punishment, the rescue. But Michael Carson knew. He traveled to Germany for the funeral, one of perhaps 50 people who gathered to remember a woman whose choices had rippled forward through decades. He stood at the graveside in light rain, thinking about the nurse tied to a post, about the sign that read, Traitor, about the choice to help her when walking away would have been easier. After the service, Margarethy's nephew approached him. "Thank you for coming. She spoke of you often, said you saved her life. She saved 5 men's lives first. I just documented it." The nephew handed him a folder. "She wanted you to have this. Her records from the war, the medical reports you helped create, letters from the men she saved, everything. She said you'd know what to do with them." Carson took the folder carefully. Inside, the evidence of one nurse's choice to follow ethics over ideology, to treat enemy wounded despite personal cost, to prove that mercy could work even in war's worst moments. He donated the materials to a museum in Washington, D.C. that documented World War II experiences. The curator cataloged them, filed them with thousands of other stories from the war. Occasionally, researchers would access them, historians studying medical ethics and combat, students writing papers about the Geneva Conventions, people trying to understand how individuals maintained humanity in inhuman circumstances. The story never became famous. No movies, no best-selling books, no widespread recognition. Just a file in an archive, waiting for people who needed to know that even in war's darkest moments, some people chose mercy over cruelty, ethics over ideology, treating humans as humans rather than as enemies. James Mitchell died in 2003. His children, 3 of them, all successful adults with families of their own, spoke at the funeral about their father's life. The eldest mentioned the German nurse who'd set his broken leg in 1945, who'd saved his life when abandoning him would have been safer for her. "Dad told us that story dozens of times," the son said, about a woman who chose to do right when her own side called it treason. He wanted us to remember that courage doesn't always look like combat. Sometimes it looks like a nurse treating wounded prisoners. Sometimes it looks like an American soldier cutting down someone the enemy had condemned. Small choices that turn out to be revolutionary. Michael Carson died in 2008 at age 87. His children sorted through his belongings and found letters from Margarethy, photos from the 1975 reunion, copies of the medical reports documenting what had happened in April 1945. They donated everything to the same museum where Margarethy's S papers were held. The 2 collections were filed together, the complete record of a brief encounter that had changed multiple lives. A German nurse who'd chosen mercy, an American soldier who'd chosen to help her, 5 paratroopers who'd survived because of those choices. Small moments in the vast machinery of war, but moments that mattered to the people involved. Today, in the museum's archive, researchers can access the complete story. They can read Carson's report of finding Margarethy tied to the post. They can see the medical documentation of her injuries. They can read her testimony about treating American prisoners. They can see letters from the men she saved, describing their recovery and their lives. Most visitors never see these documents. They're buried in thousands of similar files, just more evidence of war's complexity. But occasionally, someone finds them. A medical student researching ethics in combat. A historian studying the Wehrmacht's collapse. A grandchild of one of the 5 paratroopers wanting to understand family history. What they find is a story about choices. About a nurse who followed professional ethics despite political pressure. About officers who labeled mercy as treason. About an American soldier who helped someone his own side called enemy. About documentation that protected truth when lies would have been convenient. The lesson isn't complicated. Systems that punish mercy are systems that need to be destroyed. Ideologies that label kindness as treason are ideologies that deserve to fail. Individuals who choose ethics over loyalty, who treat humans as humans regardless of nationality, who document truth despite pressure to forget, those individuals create the foundations for better futures. Margarethy Schiller thought she was just doing her job, treating wounded according to professional standards. following the Geneva Conventions, providing care regardless of nationality. She didn't expect to be punished for it, didn't expect to become evidence that the regime's ideology was bankrupt, didn't expect an American soldier to save her and ensure her story survived. But all of that happened, and the ripples continue in the students she taught, in the doctors she trained, in the paratroopers' descendants who grew up knowing their grandfather survived because a German nurse chose mercy, in every person who hears the story and understands that even in war's worst moments, better choices are possible. The sign around her neck read Traitor, but she wasn't a traitor to anything that mattered. She was faithful to ethics, to humanity, to the principle that professional standards transcend political ideology. The officers who punished her were wrong. Michael Carson understood that instantly. The evidence he helped preserve proved it permanently. That's the legacy. Not fame or recognition, but a documented truth. Mercy works. Ethics matter. Treating people with dignity produces better outcomes than treating them as objects. These lessons are simple, but need constant relearning, because every generation faces pressures to abandon them. Margarete Schiller, tied to a post and labeled traitor, became proof that maintaining ethics under pressure is possible. Michael Carson, cutting her down and documenting her story, proved that recognizing others' humanity across enemy lines is achievable. Small choices, revolutionary consequences. That's how better worlds get built, one act of mercy at a time, one documented truth at a time, one person choosing ethics over expedience at a time. The archive preserves it all. The story waits. And occasionally, someone finds it and understands. Even in the darkest moments, better choices exist. We just have to be brave enough to make them.